it from its victims. For most of this emotion, there is a central one, right? And that central emotion is anger. Of course, there are other instances of epistemic injustice that do not elicit this emotion of anger. Could be some sort of despair, could be some sort of resolve to enforce some sort of change. But in general, the emotion elicited by epistemic injustice in most cases, and it's even argued for by Alison Bailey, is anger. This emotion is justified and it's an appropriate response to the injustice that people face in instances of epistemic injustice. Now, there are situations, you think of colonialism, for instance, which is a historical sort of oppression that has led to a sort of hegemonic regime in countries that experience colonialism. In instances where these hegemonic regimes have been set, we see that those who are victims of this injustice are also, in a way, appreciative for the successes that these systems offer to them, right? Because that's what's dominant to them, and achieving success within that framework is seen as, well, success. And members of that system or members of that framework show appreciation to systems that were oppressive to them. Now, in scenarios like this, it becomes possible for us to talk of an appreciative victim of epistemic injustice. So in this paper, the argument I'll be making is for an untheorized form of epistemic silencing, which I call appreciative silencing. Now, these are those instances of epistemic silencing that has three features distinct from most of the other sorts of epistemic silencing we have in the literature. One is that the perpetrator relies on hegemonic intuition. So for the victim of this sort of silencing, they subscribe to the same kind of hegemonic intuition as the perpetrator. I'll talk more about this term hegemonic intuition in more details in the course of the presentation, but this is one of the features. The second feature is that the victim is neither resistant to the oppression they experience, nor do they recognize it as a form of oppression. And again, you go back to the literature from Fricka and from other cognate epistemic bad practices that have been theorized in the literature, there is almost always a resistance from the victims of this injustice. But in cases of appreciative silencing that I argue for, the victims either do not recognize their situation as a case of injustice, or they do not offer resistance to it. And even when they do, this resistance does not get the uptake it deserves. And the third feature is that the victim shows or at least experiences appreciation towards the system that oppresses them. Again, I'll make these points clearer in the course of the presentation. So here is how I aim to make it clearer. I've done with this. So I'll be talking about instances where you have epistemic injustice with no anger. And I think this is key to what differentiates appreciative silencing from most of the other varieties of epistemic injustice and epistemic silencing we have in the literature. I'll give an analogy to show how it's possible for victims of harm to show appreciation for this harm. And this is when this harm is historical and continual to the lives of these victims. I'll talk about some of the specific details of appreciative silencing. I'll talk about the harm, the primary harm of appreciative silencing, and I'll conclude from there. So join me on the ride. All right, epistemic injustice with no anger. Now let's just imagine this guy, we call him Peter, right? And he's gone to some prestigious university in, let's say he went to Cambridge or some fancy university like that, right? And from before he got admission there, before he went there to study, he's been taught in his homeland, let's say he's from Nigeria, that to speak in a certain way is the ideal way, to behave in a certain way is the ideal way, to attain certain sort of knowledge is what he should aspire for. Now, this is something that is very common within past colonial states. And this way and this kind of knowledge and other kind of things like that are those of the colonizers, right? Now, Peter has accepted all this. And for Peter, that's the way to go. Now, within the literature on epistemic decolonization, it's been theorized a lot what epistemic colonization entailed and what epistemic decolonization also entails. I'm not going to go too much into it, but just for the those within our crowd that are not very familiar with the literature on epistemic decolonization. In general, epistemic colonization means those practices that are harmful to the epistemic lives of the colonized as producers and receivers of knowledge. So let's imagine during colonialism, we had things like epistemicide, linguicide. These were harmful practices that accompanied colonialism, and there were also epistemic injustice, and these can be theorized in instances, right, from colonialism. These epistemicide and linguicide, for instance, we could theorize the hermeneutical marginalization that arose from these sorts of practices that accompanied colonialism. Now, in the case of Peter, right, he's experienced these practices and the epistemic injustices. He is a victim of these, but he does not recognize them as such. Rather, he's grateful for the success that this system has offered him. He accepts this system to be the case. It's hegemonic in his understanding. And this sort of hegemonic understanding that Peter has, and in the way I use it to argue for appreciative silencing, it's not just restrictive to instances of maybe just colonialism, for instance. We can think of it in all cases that involve historical injustice or historical wrong. Let's think of it in case of patriarchy, for instance, right? There's this popular, right? In Peter's case, he thanks the system and he forms the hegemonic intuition. Let's think of this happening in a case like patriarchy, for instance. Well, there's this popular riddle that a boy gets in an accident, and after the accident, his father takes him to the hospital. When he got to the hospital, the doctor said, "I can't treat him. He's my son." Now we're thinking the father took him to the hospital. Why can't the doctor treat him? The father wasn't the doctor. For most of us, when we think of a doctor, this is what comes to mind, right? But in the case of this riddle, the answer is that the doctor is actually the boy's mother. These are some of those sort of intuitions we have. You hear doctor, you think of a man. You hear nurse, you think of a woman. These sort of intuitions, we hold them. They're in most cases unquestioned, and even in cases where they are harmful to others, there's an expectation for these people to understand that, well, that's just how things are, either because statistically we have more male doctors or for some other reason, but there is an expectation to understand that, yeah, this harmful intuition about a certain issue should be accepted, understood, like you should just get that that's how things are. Now, seeing how hegemonic intuitions, right, can be formed and remain harmful in most cases to those who subscribes to them, the question becomes, what makes it possible for victims of epistemic injustice now that subscribe to certain hegemonic intuition to be appreciative of the injustice that they face? And I'm going to use a non-epistemic analogy to try to show how this kind of progression could work. And from that analogy, I'll try to draw out the epistemic equivalent of it and maybe ground my arguments more within the literature on epistemic injustice. Now, let's imagine a scenario where we have a Black farmer and we have a white miner. Now, let's imagine this happening in a colonial situation. The Black farmer owns farmlands with his community. They enjoy their farming. And then a white colonial man or master comes along. And for the Black farmer, when the colonial master comes, occupies a certain piece of land, starts mining on it, the Black farmer is indifferent to it because he has his farmland. It doesn't affect him in any way. So the occupation of the land isn't really a big deal to the farmer. Over time, right, the activities of the miners meant that the land of the farmers got infected by some sort of chemicals and the productivity of the farmlands dwindle. Now, the Black farmer loses his farmlands while simultaneously the white colonial master gains success from his mining activities. Now, over time, for this Black farmer to gain any sort of success, he becomes a miner because that seems to be the more lucrative thing to do. While the Black farmer turns into a miner, mining as the activity of the white colonial master becomes dominant, right? It's what the white colonial master does. It's what the black farmer does. And the reason why the black farmer does this now is to attain success, because mining seems to be the only way to attain success. Now, I'll classify this in three ways, and that's where I'll try to get the epistemic features from this analogy from. We see from this analogy that there's a foundational problem, right? And this foundational problem is first in the indifference of the black farmer and in the occupation of the land by the white miner. The second aspect to it is that the harms of whatever was going on wasn't apparent, because while the black farmer seemed like he was just losing productivity in his farmland, while the white miner was simultaneously gaining success, it's not apparent how the success of the miner affects the productivity of the black farmers' farmlands. Now, the third aspect of it is that when mining becomes dominant, it's resilient because, first of all, it promises success, and it's hegemonic to the understanding of this community, because with a black farmer becoming a miner, he accepts that this is how we could attain success. This is the way to attain success. Now, let me, just with the way the example is, most of the theorizing on colonialism kind of points out the kind of harm that happens in situations like this. And we also see how very familiar to colonial situations a scenario like this could be. Now, let me try to flesh out the epistemic elements of what I try to ground with this intuition, with this analogy. Now, I would start with the foundational problems, right? Christy Dodson argues for a problem with epistemology, where she argues that in some cases, over time, epistemic systems, right, become so resilient that they are impervious to changes from outside. And even when you try to argue against these epistemic systems, how grounded they are, the epistemic orientations and what she calls the orienting variables within this epistemic system, means that you can't sufficiently argue against these epistemic systems because they are so strong that they provide difficult to defeat arguments grounding why they are the way they are. Now, these are the kind of situations that make it possible for more dominant epistemic systems to swallow up smaller epistemic systems. Think of the analogy, for instance, mining swallowing farming as the practice of the people within that community. And this leads to the formation of hegemonic intuitions, right? And this hegemonic intuition aspect of it is one of the aspects that critically differentiates my argument from Dodson's own, right? Because there is an emphasis here on the initially oppressive system, and there's also an emphasis on the historically persistent nature of this system. So I just use an analogy that seems short, but in cases of epistemic colonization, for instance, it is something that started with an initially oppressive system, colonialism, and historically persistent with what within the literature is referred to as coloniality. That's the sustenance of these harmful things that accompanied colonialism, right? This is what grounds the formation of hegemonic intuition, because when it remains persistent and offers some sort of success, it becomes easy for every member of that society to see the system as the way to go and not really notice anything wrong with a system that is formed in that way. Now, the second aspect is the resilience and the hegemony that comes from this, right? In cases where epistemic systems are harmful within the literature, the expected result or the expected response from the victims of these epistemic harms or wrongs is resistance. And this is like within the literature. So think of Medina's epistemology of resistance. You think of Bailey that argues that anger is the appropriate response to injustice. And when she argues for two-tone management practices, that this angry response to injustice is an appropriate response. And you think of Fricka's conceptions of epistemic injustices and how the victims at least in cases of testimonial injustice, offer some sort of resistance, but then this doesn't usually get the uptake it deserves. This is our expected response, right? When an epistemic system is harmful to us, resistance. But in cases of appreciative silencing, there is no resistance, or even if there is resistance, this resistance fails to get any sort of uptake. So let's imagine in the example I used of Peter, who goes to a fancy university. Let's say he comes back home, tries to teach within a school back in his country. Even if there are members of that school that are like, huh, you can't tell me not to speak in my own language. Peter has good enough reasons, or at least is well equipped, right, due to the resilience of the epistemic system he has come to adopt, to give good enough arguments, or at least seemingly good arguments, to show why members of this school should adopt this epistemic system. And he could point to himself as an example of how acceptance of this epistemic system promises success in some way. Now, the third aspect of it is that the harms are not apparent. And this, I think, it's actually one of the most dangerous aspects of this sort of appreciative silencing, the fact that the harms are not apparent, because it creates what I tag believable agent of injustice. Some of you might know who she is. But let's imagine Peter now, right, as this believable agent of epistemic injustice. There are some features that Peter has that would make it difficult for us to really flesh out instances of epistemic injustice or appreciative silencing when they come from Peter. One of them is that there is no prejudicial stereotype. And it's something we talked about, or that was mentioned in the first talk, the importance of there being some social conditions, right, for instances of epistemic injustice. Now with Peter, these social conditions or any sort of prejudicial stereotype against Black people is not present, because he is a Black person, he is a Nigerian in this scenario, and how do we say he's being epistemically unjust to his own people? He doesn't have this characteristic of having a position of social dominance or having any prejudicial stereotype against the people whom he's perpetuating appreciative silencing against. He's a member of the marginalized group. So we think of the literature on social epistemology and the importance we give to the situatedness of knowledge. If Peter, as a member of the marginalized group, is talking about the experiences of members of that group, we would want to believe what Peter is saying. And if what Peter is saying are these things that are pernicious to members of his group, we wouldn't really see it as such, or at least it's not very easy to see how these things can be pernicious in any way. And as a result of that, Peter gets higher credibility. So think of an instance of typical epistemic injustice, for instance. When there is a victim of epistemic injustice and there's someone in a socially superior position and they talk about members of marginalized group or their experiences, we would very easily want to discredit them because of maybe what we know now within the literature on social epistemology or epistemic injustice. But if Peter says something, would give him higher credibility as a member of that group who, in a sense, would expect to be representing that group's experience. What happens with this is that the spread of ignorance and the spread of knowledge begins to look very identical, because Peter, whom would expect from our understanding of social epistemology to be knowledgeable about the affairs of his people, becomes an agent of ignorance. He is a believable agent of injustice, but then he's also spreading ignorance simultaneously. Now, in cases where this happens, right, the primary harm is to the knowledge economy, because think of with the example of colonialism I used initially, for instance, where we talk of linguicide, epistemicide, and other epistemic bad practices that accompanied it. This knowledge that is being lost is a loss to the knowledge economy as a whole, right? And there is the secondary harm, which is a harm to the victim. And I'm not saying the primary harm now beats the secondary harm or is superior to it in any way. The reason I've differentiated it in this way is because the secondary harm here to the victim is what most of the theorizing on epistemic injustice, on agential epistemic injustice captured. And in instances of appreciative silencing, we're able to see this harm to the victim when we look at it from these other forms of epistemic injustice within the literature. But the harm to the knowledge economy, it's not very apparent because of the obscure nature of appreciative silencing. Now, just to wrap up, I had started the talk with the aim of answering the question whether it's possible to talk of an appreciative victim of epistemic injustice. And I've argued that it's possible through the phenomenon of appreciative silencing. And it's a kind of epistemic silencing that happens through reliance on hegemonic intuitions that are resilient to meaningful resistance. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Abe, for, as always, awesome presentation. And Carl's got his hand up already. Teacher's pet. First he phones his psychology friend, and then he's like first in line.
Oh, I thought someone else raised their hand because I didn't want to be first. So I'm happy to step back.
No, go for it.
I just really enjoyed this, Abe. But I have a question about. So I'll use Peter, the first example, for my question. So I'm wondering a little bit about the agency of Peter in this way. Have you thought about? Do you view him as a victim, which is the language you used, or do you think he's also culpable to some extent in this? So I thought of, so for example, you could think of it, or I thought of it in some way in the language of vice epistemology, that he might have some sort of epistemic vices. And I also thought of so in the decolonial literature, you would find someone like Aroa Segbe, sorry about the pronunciation, who makes the case, who critiques African scholars for having bought into the Western epistemologies for too much, right? So I'm thinking, do you think that Peter is just a victim here, and that putting blame on him would be victim blaming, or do you think he's also culpable or having some vices in some sense in this case?
Thanks for your question, and it's something I've thought about, and it's a little bit of both, right? So with the appreciative silencing and the formation of the hegemonic intuition, there is a historical aspect to it, but there is also the continual aspect to it, right? The historical aspect and the injustices that accompany that, obviously Peter has no blame in any of that. In the continual aspect to it, there's an extent to which we also can't blame Peter, right? But there's also an extent to which he is now a perpetrator of it, of this sort of injustice, but he's not like a conscious perpetrator of it. I don't know if that makes any sense, right? Due to him subscribing to these intuitions, which he had no control over initially, he becomes a perpetrator of it. I don't know to what extent, again, we can really blame him, but most of the blame in this, in the way I see it anyway, lies with the historical and persistent nature of these injustices.
Lawrence.
Yeah, thank you for your very interesting talk. I'm really I really enjoyed, a part of the talk, especially when you made an analogy of Peter. It's very, very interesting. But here comes my question. Can we subscribe to the fact that probably a form of ignorance may be a kind of agency in decolonization? I come again. Since it is possible for someone to know the wrong thing and become an effective instrument of perhaps moving in that direction, okay, can we imagine that probably someone who is far from this knowing the wrong thing might become a more reliable agent of decolonization.
Right. So maybe just to be clear, so in your question now,
Yes.
who is this person that knows the wrong thing?
Yes, you made an analogy of a Peter, and for me it's very, very important, because a lot of things we have to, in quote, battle with, maybe probably the Peters we have, the philosophical Peters, sociological Peters, all over the African knowledge industry. they've probably known, I would say, they've not probably had the right knowledge, but they have knowledge. They are influential, we accept them. We probably have to do a lot to unknow or de-know, if there's any word like that, for us to probably have the correct type of knowledge that can make us agents that can decolonize. So my question is, can we say that probably a form of ignorance might be more relevant to the decolonial paradigm we're looking for?
So, I mean, I'll be slow to think of it as a form of ignorance that's necessary for it, right? Because if we use ignorance as what we want, as, yeah, let's not know, so that we can formulate these decolonial paradigms, there's first of all the risk of us doing exactly the same thing over and over again. And I think the benefits of the formerly colonized, right? What I think is one of the main reasons why in these sorts of debates, and in most knowledge debates even, voices of the previously colonized or previously marginalized more generally should be listened to, is because of the double consciousness they have. So that's something Du Bois argues for. We know what they know, we know what we know. They know what they know, they don't know what we know. We can't now decide, okay, we are not going to learn anything about them, because like with the Peter, for instance, we never had that option. But now it's up to Peter and maybe the formerly colonized to also bring what they know into the limelight. So not a form of deliberate ignorance, because with deliberate ignorance, it becomes very easy to do things that are similar to contributory injustice, for instance, where we ignore things that might otherwise have been useful to us as epistemic agents. So not necessarily ignorance, but some sort of prioritizing of epistemic systems.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, we have a question from Jason, and then I'll ask the people who put comments in the chat to come out and make them verbally, if that's okay. But first, Jason.
Thanks, Abe. I appreciate the approach you took there. I just want to throw out one thing which might be useful in your response about culpability, because if Peter is culpable in some sense here, the claim is that it's an epistemic vice. So I just wanted something that I think bears here, and I'm just suggesting it as a resource, not giving you a thoroughly mapped out idea how, is Lisa Tessman's idea of burdened virtues, where there's going to be a threshold condition for how culpable the victim of injustice can themselves be. And it might be something we want to bring into play when you're considering those kinds of questions. I don't have a mapped out idea of what that is, but I think any answer you want to give there might benefit from that.
Thank you very much. Sounds like something that'll be useful. Check it out. Thank you.
And Ronke, do you want to speak up, or are you going to make me earn my keeper's chair and make me read it out? Okay.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes. Brilliant.
Yeah, I just something that came to my mind with the analogy of the black miner and the colonial master is how you use the word success there, as the black miner feeding into the success of the colonial master. It's kind of vague to me, because in trying to say the the Black man succeeds. I'm trying to understand how that works. Perhaps it's just trying to survive, not really trying to be totally silenced, or how do I put it now? It's feeding into the hegemonic intuition, not just because it wants to succeed, but because it wants to survive. I don't know if my comment makes any sense, because the idea of success there will be different to him than to the colonial master. The idea of success. Do you get my point? I think that's the notion of success there. I really don't, it doesn't come clear to me with what the Black farmer is trying to do. The Black farmer turned miner, yeah.
Thank you for your question. So maybe I'll try to answer it, right, by talking about the epistemic aspect of it, and also linking it to Michael's presentation we just listened to, right?
Okay.
And so something that came to my mind in the course of his presentation. We talk of the epistemic, we talk of the superiority of mainstream medicine. And there are two questions as to whether, is it because it's epistemically superior, or is it because it's the medicine of the powerful people? Now, in cases where it's simply because of the epistemic superiority, I think as virtuous epistemic agents, we need to take it seriously. But we also can't ignore the fact that, right, in the formation of these mainstream, generally now, epistemic systems, there were these initial harms that accompanied it. So think of mainstream medicine. As effective as it might be, we also need to know that there were other medical traditions that were sidelined, right, to make these as mainstream as they are. Same thing with epistemic traditions. So when some epistemic traditions are mainstream, we also need to realize that some epistemic traditions were sidelined to make it mainstream. And these ones that were sidelined, in most cases, were not sidelined simply because they were ineffective, but simply because they came from the wrong group of people, right? So when I talk about success there, the success is now, think of mainstream medicine, the apparent success it offers versus traditional medicine. Think of even within academics, the success that, I don't know, knowing about certain kind of philosophers offer you versus knowing about some other kind of obscure philosophers. Now, the success obviously has economic benefits, and in other cases, I don't know, life benefits in the case of medicine, for instance, right? But when the farmers in my example adopt mining as a way to attain success, it's not because they weren't surviving on farming. It's not because there was anything wrong with farming. It's just because somehow mining became dominant in a way that destroyed farming. And as a result, they have to switch to farming as the only alternative they have left. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I get you better now. Yes, I do. I get it better now. Yes.
Thanks, Ed. Apologies to everyone for continuing to record. I forgot to